Welcome back, everyone. Today, you hear me being excited because we're talking about one of my favorite topics, which is infidelity. I realize that I like all of these topics that are, I think that we normally consider them like morally black and white, like narcissism, because in reality, when you start examining them, they're incredibly nuanced, incredibly gray, much more common than we think, and often have some sympathetic origins. So,
yeah, I mean, I was just reading that that infidelity is supposed to happen in 20 to 25% of marriages, and up to 75% of young adult relationships. So that is staggeringly common, right?
Yeah, and I wonder, do you know how they're defining infidelity there? Is it sex?
Yeah, in the literature, they say that infidelity is considered emotional, sexual, or romantic involvement that violates an existing relationship's commitment norms. So I'm sure infidelity and cheating can mean different things to different people, but that's just how they're defining it. And that is 20 to 25% of marriages have that in it at some point. And 75% of just regular dating relationships and young adulthood. So it's pretty high.
I wouldn't be surprised if it's even higher, because there's probably a lot of people who have done things that their partner might consider infidelity, but that they have justified away. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the core issues in infidelity, we treat it like it's a black and white thing, but it's actually not very well defined at all. What's an emotional betrayal that has, or I don't remember how you defined it, but like an emotional behavior that has exceeded the boundaries of the relationship? Like, how exactly do you define that? Right. Is it when you start to have a pitter-patter in your heart and then you start talking to the person who creates that pitter-patter? Is it you have too deep of a conversation one night? Is it have too deep of a conversation 5 nights in a row? Like, it's really, really difficult to define.
Well, I'm resting on the part of the definition that says that it violates an existing relationship's commitment norm. So I think it really would be subjective of like what would be considered cheating according to the couple, which often is not explicitly defined, right? Exactly. You kind of figure that out when you hear that someone is like hanging out with the person of the opposite sex and getting closer, and the other person gets jealous. That's when you know it's like violated a norm. But this is not all like, you don't sit down and say, what do you consider cheating? Maybe you should.
Yeah, maybe. I think something else that can help is a lot of questions I've gotten every time talking about infidelity is like, is this considered cheating? Is this infidelity? And part of me wants to answer, maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it's, does this make me uncomfortable? Because that changes it from, is he or she doing something wrong, to, is this something that I can live with in my relationship? And it also focuses on, I think, the behavior instead of, has my partner committed a wrongdoing? It's more like, is there a process happening in my relationship that's unsustainable or that we need to talk about or fix?
Yeah, I mean, I still see this as all like there's an either implicit or explicit, like either you had a conversation about this together or not, but what is okay between you and your partner, right? Like, and it might be different standards for each person, right? There might be a situation where one person is in the partnership is allowed to engage in more of those kind of relationships and the other one isn't. Mm-hmm. Or you would come together and say, these are the standards. But I still think it has, because you're dealing with a relationship, it's an agreement between two people, right? And if one is violating an agreement, even if it's like spoken or unspoken, I would say that might be a signal, like that discomfort might be a signal that the violation is happening, but I still think that it should be mutually determined, right?
Yeah, I think it can just take a bit for that to be mutually determined. Like if Paul met a woman at work and started getting really close with her and talking to her all the time, at what point would that go from a friendship to an emotional affair? Mm-hmm. And like my friends might have different opinions about this, you know. Me knowing that my relationship with him is really secure, I might put up with a lot more than my friends might. They might be like, Jacqueline, seriously, this is weird. This feels like emotional cheating. What if they're out why are they out so late? Something like that. Other people consider like watching porn and masturbation to be infidelity. Yeah. And so it's like, you might not that I'm just saying, like, is it infidelity might be the wrong question. It might be like going back to the definition of what you were talking about. Like, this is something that doesn't fit within our relationship very well. It's something that needs to stop, or it needs to be something that we kind of come to a new agreement about.
And it might actually change based on the status of your relationship, right? Like if you are flirting with somebody or having that kind of emotional connection with someone else when you guys are stable and good and feel trusting, versus like if you're on the rocks, there might be different reactions to it. So I think you're bringing up a good point that we might have the stats of like 20% cheat, but what that actually means is still unclear.
We just know it's high. It happens all the time, and it's too high to just say 25% of the country is married to a narcissist. Like, we're so used to hearing infidelity and saying, break up with them, get out, he's a narcissist, she's a narcissist, like, your relationship is over. To I guess, preempt this, I just read Esther Perel's The State of Affairs yesterday. She is a relationship therapist who works a ton with infidelity, and ever since first watching her TED Talk, Esther has been somebody that I like. Everything she says is like the Bible to me. I'm like, yes, I've been feeling this for so long, haven't been able to articulate it. I think I really get her. And she comes from a place of affairs don't have to be the end of your relationship. Sometimes they are, but oftentimes you can, as she says, start a new relationship together. Your first relationship is over. Do you want to create a new relationship together?
Well, how does she understand, and we could talk about this versus John Gottman, the researcher we were talking about last time, but how does she understand why infidelity happens? Because I'm sure that people listening are like, I was cheated on, or I was, I'm tempted to, or I have. Why is this happening?
I would say the biggest difference between her and Gottman is that she does not believe that you have to be in a bad relationship to cheat. She sees people cheat all the time who are in wonderful relationships. John Gottman thinks that cheating is a symptom of the relationship gone awry. And Esther gives a lot of examples of that as well, but she starts the book actually talking about something that I really identified with, which is the enormous expectations we put on our marriages today, and how this has changed over time. So things like marriage used to be considered a cornerstone. So you get to about 20 years old, you get married, and then you build a life together. And, mistakes may happen along the way. Divorce was not really an option, but you kind of grow together and you go through those developmental changes where you're a little bit messy together. And now it's considered more of a capstone. I get married when all of my ducks are in a row. I've got my career. I'm at my height of maturity, and the spouse is almost considered like this gleaming cherry on top that will be your emotional, sexual, intellectual support, that this person is in a way expected to transform you. It's this highly romantic ideal of what the spouse is these days as sort of capping your life. And there's this thought that like suddenly, because it's a capstone, we have moved past the years where we might transgress, and we're coming together as like two gleaming people ready to complete each other. And it's just these such high expectations. And then also we live in an individualistic culture where it's almost like there's a moral imperative that we are supposed to chase our highest sort of form of being, or like highest happiness. And so that might mean, okay, so we're in a relationship. Well, what happens when we meet another person and all of a sudden we feel this love towards them? Are we supposed to deny ourselves the greatest form of love we could have? And so on the one hand, it's like infidelity should never occur because we're these, we're at our best states, we're coming together, we're going to transform each other. But then at the same time, there's almost more temptation because we're saying to ourselves, we're supposed to reach the highest version of ourselves. We're supposed to be as happy as possible. That's our prerogative. And so, when the marriage starts to flag, it gets boring, you have kids, like you don't see each other as much, and then some sparkly, other man or other woman is there, it can feel like an imperative to go and engage in the affair.
Okay, well then I could see how the Gottman and Perel definition, understanding of how infidelity happens can be mixed, right? It could still be considered a symptom of something lacking or problems in the relationship. Mm-hmm. But maybe Esther Perel is adding that our expectations for what is like a good relationship or bad relationship, or when a relationship is lacking or full, that is informing. Like if we think I need to go to my, my highest self, my highest source of happiness, then naturally monogamy or any single person is not going to fulfill that, right? One person can fulfill everything, right? So inherently, you might see that as a problem where being monogamous is not going to lead you to your highest,
I think
it's most actualized self, or whatever you want to say, right?
Yeah, most actualized self is perfect. I think Gottman is it's a problem within a relationship, and Esther's well, kind of. It's just that if that's your approach to relationships, or that's what your expectation for a relationship is, you're always going to find those problems, and there will always be an excuse to cheat,
right,
or a reason to cheat. And I also love another thing she says about why we cheat is that we're not necessarily looking for another person. We're looking for another version of ourselves. So when we settle down and get married, we choose a partner with, a limited set of characteristics. We have a limited set of characteristics. We become a certain person when we're with them. And as the relationship progresses, sex probably isn't going to be as spicy. The honeymoon period ends. You have kids, you have responsibilities, and you start longing for these versions of yourself that you have put to bed. The spicy version of yourself, the, appealing, sexy, the one who has intellectual conversations till 3 a.m. Mm-hmm. All those things kind of stop with your primary spouse. And so when you have this glimmer of hope over here, it's like all of these parts of yourself are suddenly awakened. And that's incredibly powerful. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. And I have to say, it's been my biggest concern about getting married is what happens when I miss those pieces of myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that is interesting because there are pieces of ourselves that are just going to come out in the chase and new relationships or crushes. I think that times when I've been tempted, I haven't fully cheated, but there's been in relationships when, I felt like it's on the rocks, or, we've talked about breakup, but it's, towards or drifting apart. I've had crushes on people, and that's sometimes my signal of when I really need to end the relationship. But I've had crushes on people, and it brings out the side of me that is goes towards stuff. So you know me, that I love obsessing about something and going towards a goal and chasing something, working towards something more proactive. And crushes bring that out of me, right? The idea of ooh, I'm focusing on something. How do I get that? Do they like me back? That those kind of parts.
It's activating.
Yeah, exactly. It's activating, and that is really common for the crush stage of a relationship. But once you're in a deep relationship, that's less available. So I found it in different areas of my life. When I'm in a serious relationship, it's work is more captivating of my attention because I could have that kind of chase and activated part there. But no, it's hard. It's what do you do when there's certain parts of you that come out during that courtship phase that you really miss?
I've honestly, this is going to sound bad, but I really don't think it is. I think I had such idealistic expectations about what love and marriage was supposed to be that I honestly had to mourn them. Mm-hmm. When I realized, no, marriage isn't this fairy tale. And I am going to have to quiet myself in certain ways. Because, I'm not going to be activated by other men. I'm not going to be in this hunting period all the time. I'm not, even like half of, I think, my obsession with New York was just feeling activated all the time because I was searching for a mate. Mm-hmm. And I really had to kind of grieve that a bit and say, no, it's not about me actualizing myself. It's about, well, I suppose it's about doing that in a different way. It's about more acceptance of reality in another person, and the beauty in that. But I think for so long we're thinking about like this mythical feeling and state of being that we're sold in the media and by fairy tales and by what our own hearts do, and we're infatuated. And I don't know if everybody always gets over that, or whenever there's that glimmer of hope for that again, it's just so hard to resist.
Yeah, and I do think that, yeah, that makes sense. And even beyond the finding the person, there, like, people chase that feeling, that the hunt, even like even further, like starting to plan a wedding, right. Or start to have children, or there's other stages past that can feel like the activated seeking phase. And I think that's part of my mistake with with my marriage that I will talk about in the divorce episode, but kind of transitioning from the hunt for the mate to like the hunt for other stuff with the mate. You could kind of stave off that grieving period by chasing the next stage. But then when that's over, right, when that settles down, when you come back from the honeymoon and then it's just like back to work on Monday, yeah, that might be a time when it's most vulnerable to like, okay, now what? Or, I realize that this doesn't fulfill everything in me and every part of who I like to be with a partner. Maybe that's the time when infidelity risk is high.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see whether infidelity occurs more often after kids. I mean, I can probably, just because you have kids early in the marriage, and so there's just a longer stretch of time in which to be unfaithful. But also you're not as young and glorious looking as you are before kids, so I don't know. But I think, she talks about a lot of examples where the kids come, sex life dies, and affairs start. So it wouldn't surprise me. Another thing she talks about is just the idea of the erotic, which isn't, by this she's not meaning sex. She's meaning the sense of transgression, as you'd say, like activation. This idea of having a secret to keep. And one thing she said that I loved is, and this goes along with like maybe infidelity happens more after kids, is that an affair is, you can never say that you're doing it for somebody else. It's definitely for you. And if you are in the stage of your life where your life is about your work, whether that's taking care of patients, clients, your boss, whatever, then you have kids, you're constantly taking care of kids, you're taking care of your spouse, all of a sudden this affair is something for you. It's your opportunity to be selfish, and there's something incredibly erotic about that. So I really, it saddens me that in this culture, and I might be thought of as a hypocrite here because I did this a bit in the narcissism episode, I would consider my ex who cheated on me a narcissist, but it was not because of the cheating. It was because of the temper tantrums and the mistreatment and abuse and lying and manipulation and gaslighting. But I think we are very tempted to write off everybody who cheats as a bad person. Once a cheater, always a cheater. We often tell the person who's been cheated on, get out of the relationship immediately. But when you really peel back the reasons for why people cheat, it's incredibly human. It's like the most human mistake. If it is a mistake, and I think there are some times when it's not, it's the right thing to do.
The question now is like, what does a couple do after there's been cheating, after that their infidelity has happened? And I just, looking at the literature, I just thought it was interesting that people who have been cheated on report a lot of mental health symptoms of like depression, anxiety, and PTSD. So like trauma symptoms. And when I read that, it was kind of validating because the one time that I knew for sure I was cheated on, I'm sure maybe I've been cheated on more, but it was just a brief relationship, a couple weeks where it ended because the person came to me and said, my ex just told me she's pregnant.
Yeah.
And he said it was, she's a couple months pregnant, so it's not as, it was before our time. And basically it ended there. He kind of disappeared, which was awful. But then when I kind of looked at the past, when I kind of looked at the evidence, I kind of looked back on, our communication and really looked into it, I realized that he must have been sleeping with her while we were together because the timeline just didn't make sense. And there was just like certain elements that, things that he said that he was like hanging out with friends, even though there was kind of something fishy about it. So like putting the pieces together, I realized that I'd been cheated on. And I remember feeling like I went through a trauma. Like I kept trying to look back at why it happened, like repeating details over and over to my friends, like including you. And I remember it feeling like times I've been traumatized where my brain was trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. And this lack of control, like feeling like I had no control and feeling so stupid. I think that was one thing that I really felt stupid, that I had a sense that something was fishy, something that there was some deceit happening, but I let it go. And now it made me look back on every moment that we were together, everything he said to me, wondering in that moment, did he go back and sleep with someone else that night? My mind kept like fixating on those details. And I had to get over it like a trauma. I had to accept that I have no control over it. I had to accept that I did what I could and I wasn't stupid for not realizing it, right? And so, yeah, it's a trauma. It can be a trauma.
Yeah, I think especially these ones where the affairs, I mean, the full story that Kibby's talking about is one of the most insane, really, like, dating stories I think I've ever heard. And I'm going to put this guy in the personality disorders camp. But, I mean, it was just, the entire duration of their relationship was just cheating, lies, manipulation, craziness, and then it all culminated in insanity. So I think you're very justified in having these feelings of being completely out of control. And I think that's what happens, especially in affairs that stretch on, and therefore it's not like, okay, my spouse had a one-night stand, either covered it up or immediately told me about it. Especially if you immediately tell, then your reality hasn't been as upended as realizing that there has been a stretch of time, sometimes years, where you have just not known what's going on in your own life. You have been living a different reality, or thought that you were living a different reality than you were. And that is just immensely destabilizing. And then it's like, what am I supposed to believe? What was real? What wasn't real? These things did he love me during this time? What did it mean when he said he loved me? What were his feelings? Did they exist?
Yeah.
What was he doing at 10 a.m. when I thought he was at work or whatever, and I was folding my kids' laundry? Like, all of these thoughts, just trying to reconstruct what happened. And Esther calls it, in order to create a plan for the future, you rely on the past. You're like, okay, what are the patterns from the past that I can rely on and, make sense of my future with? And when your past has been taken away from you, then it's so hard to know what to do going forward.
Right. It makes sense why you would want to know every moment. Like, there's times where people want to know all the details. When was that my partner actually with them? What did they do? And it's just like that kind of sense of like, I want to construct the reality. I want to know what actually happened in my past, even if it's a painful amount of detail. Yeah. I want some sense of like knowing what actually happened versus what was like a complete illusion.
Yeah. So that's tip number 1. If you've cheated on your partner and they are asking you questions incessantly, you just gotta let it happen for a while because they are trying to reconstruct their own reality. Like, what the hell was I living the past year?
Yeah.
What can I hang my hat on? The problem is sometimes those questions can be unhelpful, because if you're asking things like, how big was his penis? Did you come more with him than you did with me? Like, what did she smell like? Like, all of these kinds of questions that are just going to wind up torturing you, but aren't necessarily going to help you move on in any way. Like, it's not really reality constructing. It's just comparisons. And
right. And it's something that does happen when someone goes through a trauma. It's like you're trying to look at the details to try to figure out why it happened, right? So if you're trying to understand the difference in the sexual, performance or their bodies or anything like that, at least I would see that as like, I'm trying to understand why you did that, why you had to find someone else. Was I not good enough, right? Mm-hmm. So, but I mean, some questions that I've gotten is it true that once a cheater, always a cheater, right? Yeah. Should we just say that some people are cheaters and some people are not, and you should just find the people who are not cheaters to be with? Like, I don't think it's that simple, but there might be character traits that kind of lend some people to be more likely cheaters or not. Like, I think about it, like, if you cope with issues and conflicts with avoidance or deception or hiding,
callousness,
right? I wouldn't say that makes someone, like, quote, a cheater, but they might handle their problems instead of coming to you and talking about why there's a rift or something missing in the relationship. They might just try to seek the solutions outside of the relationship and not tell you. So there's times that I felt similarly cheated on in other relationships, but it wasn't like with another person. It was just that person, like, lied to me about something or wasn't really forthcoming with what they were doing with their time, and then I was left kind of feeling betrayed and confused, like all the same feelings of being cheated on without having it to be with another person. Well,
that's what's so interesting, is that there's two elements, probably more than two, but like two major elements of infidelity. One is the other person, like the magic, like the sex, the love, so I guess the jealousy aspect. And the other is the manipulation, the lies, the deception, the loss of control, all of that. It's interesting. I always said, like, cheating on me is not the worst thing you could ever do to me, but it could be. Like, I'm not somebody who has a ton of jealousy, but I hate being manipulated. Like, I hate, so I think it can be helpful. When an affair happens, the first thing you have to do is obviously validate, but be there, weather the storm, accept the questions, hold them, love them, just, try to keep your anger low or under control while they're asking you these questions, lashing out at you, loving you one second, hating you the next second. Like, if you're the person who cheated, then you kind of have to weather this storm. But then after that, there can be a meaning-making phase. And then you can start parsing out, like, what was the thing that really hurt? What led me to do this? How did we each contribute to this dynamic? So all of that is the kind of meaning making, which is necessary for if you want to move on. And I think we often get stuck in, well, you cheated, that's it, that's what's wrong. But it's actually like, where was the betrayal? Was it that you slept with somebody else? Or was it that you were hiding things or manipulating me, or leaving me alone with the kids to do all this work while you were out having fun? Like, maybe the cheating was, like, not even with another woman necessarily, but you're just out watching football with your friends all the fucking time while your wife is at home with the kids. Like, there's so many elements, and so if you can break it down and get a bit more granular about it, I think it can be more useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about this from this perspective of someone who cheated or versus being cheated on. But I think the principle that you're saying is sometimes the cheating act itself can be the focus of the conflict, right? You cheated, you're in the doghouse, either we break up or I'm mad at you. But that might take away attention and conversation from maybe other issues that maybe led up to the cheating, right? The drifting apart or an unresolved problem in the marriage or relationship or what about the cheating, as you say, is the most painful part? What is the transgression, right? So like maybe a tip that we're suggesting is not just to be like, you did something wrong, bam, I'm going to see it just that way. But like, this is one piece, one major piece, and maybe a whole pattern of problems. And sometimes it's hard to work through those things together, and working in couples therapy would be great. But I mean, I think it does, you do have to also then decide whether you want to be with that person and learn to forgive and move forward, or do you want to break up? And I know that's not an easy decision, but it's hard when you two are together and then your goal is just to stay together and then punish the person who cheated. So then it just becomes like a whole other set of issues where then the person who cheated just, it creates like this power dynamic where then they are completely powerless. And I don't know if that, as you're saying about meaning making, that might not contribute to like actually like growing and learning from it, right?
She gave one example of a couple who the man cheated and then he eventually broke up with her because they had decided to stay together, but then he kept trying to make reparations and she kept denying them and rejecting them. And then when he broke up with her, her story was, well, you didn't try hard enough. You didn't try to make this up to me. And so she was victimizing herself twice. And he's like, I couldn't stay in this unsustainable dynamic where everything I do, it's just a black hole of debt. Like, I keep having to make repairs, but they're never enough because this cheating thing has just been held up as like the ultimate betrayal for which I'll have to keep paying forever. Esther gave one suggestion, which is like, seeking revenge is really not the best way to go. But sometimes if you can make that revenge somewhat collaborative, like if you can contain it and then actually move on, use it to move on, then it can be okay. Like there was one woman, again, whose husband cheated, and he was a politician, and she made him make a very large donation to his hated political rival. She's like, if you're going to spend all this money on hotel rooms, you can now spend this money on your political rival. And so he did it, and then she was able to kind of move on with a little bit of humor.
Well, then let's say then the tip is not to go for revenge, but go for repair.
Yeah.
Right? If that's your goal, is to stay together and repair and move forward, maybe you think carefully together about what the cheater can do to make up for it, and really like make that something that's you to agree upon and that actually would work, right? Like if they do it, then the other person will have to make their effort to forgive. So it's a little of a two-way street of like, how do we move forward from this, instead of just like constantly punishing until the person just decides to heals all wounds, that doesn't necessarily work.
Well, and I think it's okay to be a little bit unsure at first of what you want to do, because you're not going to know the day after you find out you've been cheated on whether you want to stay together or break up with that person. But over time, if you do stay together, it can't be just okay, well, you owe me forever now. So Kibby, as our resident therapy expert, how does one work through this in therapy?
Yeah, it's interesting too, because it's like all these pieces all the tips we're talking about is like how one can work on this just with you and your partner outside of context of couples therapy. It's not that different, actually. When you go into couples therapy, as we're saying, like you have to define together as a couple what your goal is. Do you want to stay together and work through it, or do you want to learn how to break up? I mean, looking at the research, I found a really interesting set of papers that talks about like what would make infidelity worse on your mental health. So we know that infidelity is just, associated with depression, anxiety, other types of distress, and PTSD. But then this paper was looking at what would actually, what about the infidelity would actually lead to those mental health symptoms. And what they said was it's really about how you think about the infidelity, like how you interpret what happened. And the findings were that if you really put a lot of the blame on yourself or the other person in a way that's like about their character, in a way that's stable, and how that would impact other parts of the relationship, that would lead to a lot more symptoms of anxiety and depression. So if you think that, if you were cheated on and think, wow, my partner cheated on me because he or she is a cheater and a bad person, and it's part of their personality, they're never going to change, and it ruins our entire relationship, that would lead to more depression and anxiety. And the other token, also with the self-blame, I was cheated on because I'm not good enough. I am kind of person who gets taken advantage of. I am not sexy enough, and there's nothing I could do to change it, right? Like, so just seeing it as like a problem of the person that is like unchangeable, that would lead to more issues. So I'm bringing this up because taking that research and kind of applying it to what do we do about it, it would make sense if a couple comes into couples therapy to work on beliefs like that, right? To change it from like, once a cheater, always a cheater, or I'm not good enough, to like, what happened? What was the circumstance? Like, what were things that we could change that led to the infidelity, and how can we do that differently moving forward?
Right, because there's no hope in the first interpretation.
Right.
I mean, I can see how it would be like in your case of cheating. I feel like, there wasn't much investigating we should do. It's not like what was the part about your relationship with him that led to the cheating. The part was that he has a personality disorder.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, I feel like excavating more would just keep you in it longer. But if we're talking about a marriage, and, this is somebody, your spouse is like somebody that you really have spent a lifetime loving and respecting, it's going to be really terrible to just say they're a bad person. I've wasted my entire life. There's no human cause for this. This is just shitty, always cheater, bad person. Like, that's a huge hit to take, and there's no hope in it.
Yeah, I could see that could be helpful in a way of like breaking up with them, right? Yeah. Like in my case, saying like, wow, he was just he was just a bad person, and that's why we didn't work out. That's why he cheated, and that's why we didn't work out. And it might help with the separation, but it might not help with looking back on it and like making meaning out of it, right? I mean, right. Unless the meaning is, how can I avoid someone like that in the future? Which that's the way I cope with it. Like, how do I identify and those red flags earlier and learn to not select a partner like that? There was many lessons where I made that mistake.
I have to say, you were also talking about feeling crazy, and one thing you said was that you had seen all these red flags and you had just told yourself to calm down. I think that's another huge pain for the person who's been cheated on, is they might have had their intuition up, but they chose faith and trust, and you feel like a fool when you chose those things and you were wrong. And it makes it really hard to know, like, should I stay trusting? Because that's something that you might really value in yourself, and you should. And once you've been cheated on, it's really hard to know, like, which parts of yourself to keep and how much to rely on your intuition. You don't want to become the person who's paranoid or who doesn't trust that people are inherently good. And so it takes that away from you as well, which is really terrible.
Yeah, it's true. It's like you feel stupid for being trusting. But I see it. I don't know if this is a tip or not for everyone, but it's, actually I think you and other friends, have in many situations like this I've been in where I feel kind of betrayed by the person. I feel stupid for being generous or trusting. I could only be proud that's in my value, to be a trusting, giving person. So I acted in the way that I felt was in line with my values, and if someone else took advantage of it or, betrayed that, then that's not on me, right? That's right. On the other person. But I think that in context of like wanting to work in the relationship and move past it, those thoughts of, well, he's just an asshole, is not going to be as helpful, because, you know, how are you going to build a relationship from that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it's also an interesting thing too about how, you know, we haven't even talked about this yet, but disclosing affairs, right? Do you tell the other partner that you cheated, or I wish there were a simple yes or no. I wish there was a simple yes. In the context of couples therapy, the answer is yes, because the research shows that if there is an undisclosed affair in the context of couples therapy, the couples therapy is less likely to work, right? Like, that makes sense. So a couples therapist sometimes will like hear about that from one of the partners, and the partner says, don't tell them. And I mean, I think the guidelines for doing like effective couples therapy is then to work towards disclosing, whether it's like you do it together, or you encourage that person to tell, or you just stop therapy if the person doesn't want to disclose. So it seems like if you want to work through it, discussing the affair in the context of couples therapy makes sense. But I'm sure there's a lot of reasons to not to, like, as we were saying before, right?
Yeah, I mean, Esther is sort of wishy-washy on this one, too, because she's like, that she said that's how she was trained. I think, you know, not having a clear definition of an affair can also muddy these waters. I mean, a couples therapist will often have individual sessions at the beginning with each person. So they can get a better sense of what's kind of going on behind the scenes. She does this with each person, so it's fair. Then they come together, and so people often reveal secrets to her, and her approach is to say, I'm not going to reveal these secrets. And she may, I don't know, she may do some encouragement to disclose eventually, but I think it's really hard to know. I mean, one example she gave was like, she's dealt with widows whose husbands made deathbed confessions. And then they have to grieve their husband and the marriage they didn't actually have.
Oof.
And she's like, you know, what good did that do? It made the person feel like they were in a confessional as they died, and then they were wiped clean and could die without guilt. But like, should it have? Because now you've just really, really, really upset this person, and there's no way for her to really see closure because now you're dead.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always a proponent of honesty, especially in the context of a relationship. But I do think it makes sense for the cheating partner to think about, like, what is this for? You know, right. If I'm going to disclose it to my partner, is it just to relieve my guilt and then not even think about the impact that can make? Or is it about, you know, working towards something better and being honest and open and changing? You know, so I think that just really thinking through those is important.
Yeah, I think another example is like, okay, say you've cheated and now you know that you want to break up. Do you mention the cheating?
Right.
Is that important or not? And I don't know that we have good answers.
I don't think we have good answers, but I've always, in these circumstances, I've always said, thought to myself and to, you know, my friends that as long as you focus on talking about the other issues in the relationship, right? I mean, if there was something missing that led to the cheating, if there's something wrong, if there was like an unresolved problem, like focus the conversation on that. Otherwise the cheating would just wipe out any other conversation about that and create that kind of power dynamic that doesn't really help anything and sometimes make things worse, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, like looking at the bigger picture instead of just the transgression.
So I do want to say, I mean, a big part of her book is that there is hope at the end of the tunnel. I mean, sometimes an affair really does signal doom. This isn't the right relationship. But other times it's something that you can move past, or it's something that you can actually use to make a better relationship. And this can happen all sorts of ways. I mean, I have a friend who cheated on his wife, and I remember meeting up with him, and he's like, I'm in love. I'm in love with this other woman. And I was like, oh no, this is, oh God. And then, you know, it was this very dramatic unfolding, but he wound up telling his wife, breaking up with this other woman, and now their marriage is so much stronger than it was before. I think they were in the similar, like, it had been the 10-year mark, kids, just they had grown apart, a lot of depression, just things that kind of admired them in their own separate worlds, and they weren't doing much work to conjoin those worlds. And once this sort of cataclysmic event happened, it was a wake-up call for both of them. And it was kind of a reckoning, like, are we still really important to each other? Are we still the right match? And, you know, I think what often happens is that it awakens sexuality, because all of a sudden you realize, no, this relationship is something I could lose. And so all of these forces kind of came together, and their relationship became much more transparent, honest, sexual. Yeah, and also I think realizing, like, no, I almost gave this up for somebody else. I realized that was a fantasy, and this relationship is what's real and important. Now I'm going to really fight for it. So I'm really going to be there. I'm going to stop gallivanting around the city. I'm going to be at home. I'm going to help her. I'm going to get to know her again. So many, Esther was saying, like, so many affairs spawn these 3 a.m. conversations again. People spending all night talking because they're reevaluating their values, their relationship, who they've been, and kind of reacquainting each other to each other. So they can be immensely powerful, and sometimes they can be erotic. Sometimes people can realize, like, God, yeah, our sex life is dead, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm actually kind of turned on by the image of you with this other person. Maybe that's rare, but I think it can bleed into how can we help our friends who are going through affairs. And I think one of the main pieces of advice is dump her. Dump him. This is get out. Like, if you respect yourself, get out. And that can put an additional pressure on the person who's been cheated on to make a unilateral decision and get out when maybe they would rather work on it because they feel like they don't have any self-respect if they stay.
Right. Yeah, a lot of well-meaning loved ones might say, have that kind of final, like, well, deal breaker, get out. And you're right. If you did the right thing, you would get out of the relationship. But I guess, like, loved ones can really understand from all that we talked about that it's way more complicated than that, right? It doesn't necessarily mean there's, like, a clear right and wrong, depending on the relationship. But there's, like, really assessing the personalities involved, assessing, like, the patterns that led you there, what has been missing, what were you trying to look for in that affair. How do we make sense of it and really change those problematic patterns and move forward together in this new way. Encouraging your friends, your loved ones to think about those things. And
yeah, I mean, I think I have a lot of sympathy for the friend in this situation too, because I think a lot of us have been there, especially with recurrent cheaters. And like, we've got our friend and they're in this relationship that will not end for some goddamn reason. And it's like, he or she, they're cheating on you all the time. And like, you keep going back, and it really does feel like a self-respecting. And it's so hard to know what to do with that. And I know we've talked about this previously on the podcast, but I guess that's just sort of an acceptance thing, being like, I'll be here for you when you're out of this tunnel.
Right.
But I honestly can't make you do anything. And I think for like these longer relationships where there's been an affair is just maybe trying to not rush to judgment, but actually asking, like, where are you in this? Like, what are you thinking? And having it be a legitimate option that they might want to work through this.
Yeah, and all of these tips that we're talking about right now make sense for probably like later on, once the affair has been revealed and once they have time to figure out like what are my next steps. But I do know that in the acute phase, like when it just happens and it feels like a trauma, probably a different set of strategies for loved ones could be helpful. Like when it first happened to me, I know it was just super helpful for my friends and family to just really listen, have their normal emotion reactions of shock and anger on my behalf, and just being patient while I went over the details over and over, or kept asking questions, or try to puzzle out when did it first start, and, you know, like, give a listening ear and let that person kind of work through their trauma about discovering that, you know, this betrayal. It's helpful in the immediate aftermath of when they discover the affair.
Yeah, I mean, I think being there, supporting your friend, and really listening is always a good piece of advice. And just letting them get it out. I mean, it's kind of similar for the person, for the spouse who did the cheating. Like, you gotta just be there and hold their hand and hold them and allow them to do this reconstructing and mining and feel like they've lost their mind a bit. Another thing is that another reason why an affair can be invigorating for some couples is it can give them a jolt to be like, wait, I have become lost in this marriage a little bit. Like, my entire identity has become my kids and my husband or my wife, and I've now realized that my spouse has gone out and found a different identity. Well, actually, I can do that too. I can reacquaint myself with the things that I used to love. I can strengthen my friendships. I can pick up old hobbies. I can write more. I can read more. Whatever it is, so I think if you've been cheated on, one thing that can help after you go through the intense emotional agony is to start rebuilding parts of yourself that maybe you've sacrificed.
And that's something that loved ones can definitely help with. That's definitely a tip for loved ones, to help that person re-engage in other parts of their lives and make it more full, and discover different parts about themselves that they probably missed, either being cheated on or that led to the cheating. So
yeah. Awesome. Well, I think that's it for our infidelity episode. So the resources we talked about today, well, the big one is The State of Affairs, Rethinking Infidelity by Esther Perel. She also wrote a book called Mating in Captivity, which kind of talks about bringing eroticism into your life before cheating occurs. So that could be a good resource as well.
And even she has a great podcast. So it's called Where Do We Begin?
Where Should We Begin? Yeah. And it's real couples therapy. Basically, she does a one-time couples therapy episode that's 3 hours. She condenses it to a 45-minute podcast, but a ton of couples who are surviving through infidelity on there, and you just sort of see like what a really, really talented couples therapist might do for you and what a therapy session might look like. So I hope you check her out, and thank you again for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and we will see you next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.